Wyoming Territory, July 1872. The sky was burning orange when the wagon train was hit. Smoke rose in thin, haunted lines against the horizon, the smell of gunpowder and scorched canvas thick in the air. Scattered wagons lay broken across the dry prairie, wheels cracked, trunks overturned, and bodies still. The wind carried the low thrum of buzzards circling high above. She was the only one left moving. Sienna Whitlow sat in the dirt by the splintered wheel of the wagon her father had built with his own hands. Her dress was torn at the hem, streaked with dust and blood that was not her own. Her hair, once pinned in careful braids, now hung loose and tangled down her back. She stared at nothing, her lips parted, breath shallow. The left side of her forehead had a shallow cut, bleeding slow and quiet. They had come fast riders in the morning light, faces covered, rifles raised. The shots rang out before anyone could shout a warning. Her mother had fallen first. Her younger brother tried to run. Sienna had crawled beneath the wagon, fists pressed to her ears as screams tore through the plains. The raiders took the horses and whatever supplies they could carry. Then they left, and somehow they missed her. The prairie was silent now except for the wind and the creak of old wood. Then came the sound of hooves. Slow, measured. One rider, she did not move, she did not hide. She just watched the dust rise, eyes glazed and empty. The man rode alone, tall in the saddle, his coat coated in trail dust. His horse, black, lean, and steady, slowed when they came upon the wreckage. The rider scanned the ground, his jaw tense, hand near his revolver. He looked like he carried the whole of the frontier in his shoulders. Then he saw her. He dismounted without a word, boots quiet in the dirt. He did not rush, he did not shout, he just walked over and crouched beside her. "Miss." His voice was low, careful. "You hurt anywhere bad?" She blinked, slow. Her lips tried to move, but no sound came. He looked her over, saw the blood on her temple, the raw scrapes on her hands. "I am going to sit here beside you," he said. "Unless you want me to go." She did not answer. But she did not flinch when he sat down on the ground next to her, knees bent, arms resting on them. He set his hat in the dirt beside him. His face was sun-browned, with dark eyes that watched everything. "My name is Vaughn Reddick," he said after a long moment. "I was trailing cattle west, saw the smoke." Still, she said nothing. Her gaze drifted to the wagon again, to the small shoe lying in the dust. Vaughn followed her eyes. His jaw clenched, then softened. "Who was with you?" Sienna swallowed. Her voice came out cracked. "My mother, my brother, they are gone." "I am sorry," he said, and meant it. She turned her head slightly, looking at him for the first time. Her eyes were green, rimmed red, but dry. "I did not run," she said. "I could not move. There is no shame in that. I should have." "No," he said firmly. "You are alive. That is what matters." She looked away. A wind passed over them, lifting the hem of her dress, tossing her hair into her face. He reached out and gently tucked it behind her ear. She stiffened but did not pull back. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated. Then, Sienna Whitlow." "Well, Sienna Whitlow," Vaughn said, voice calm as the plains. "I will not leave you here." She blinked again. "Where would I go?" "Wherever you want." "But you will not go alone." Her lip trembled at that, and her hand came up to cover her mouth. The first sob broke through her chest like a cracked dam. She folded forward, shoulders shaking. Vaughn did not speak. He just moved a little closer and let her cry. When she leaned into him, he wrapped an arm around her carefully, like he was afraid she might break. They stayed like that until the sun dipped low. Later, he built a fire with what little dry wood he could find. He gave her his canteen and a strip of jerky from his saddlebag. She ate slowly, fingers trembling. That night, he laid her a bedroll and turned his back while she lay down. Then he sat up beside the fire, rifle across his lap, watching the dark. She opened her eyes once in the night and found him still there. When morning came, he helped her up onto his horse. She rode in front, his arms steady around her, guiding the reins. They did not talk much that first day. But every time she looked back, he was still with her, and he never left again. By the third day, the silence between them had changed its shape. It no longer pressed heavy like grief. It moved like breath, something shared without needing to be filled. Sienna rode ahead of Vaughn now, her back straightening a little more each morning. She still hadn't asked where they were going, and Vaughn hadn't offered, not because he was hiding anything, but because she hadn't asked. He figured when she wanted to know, she'd say so. The land stretched wide and dry around them, the cottonwoods growing thicker as they followed the river south. They kept mostly to the low ground, where the soil held prints longer and the water wasn't far. At night, he tethered the horse and walked the edge of the brush, checking for signs of wolves or men. She watched him from the fire, her hands wrapped around the tin cup he'd given her. That evening, as the stars came out quiet and slow, she asked, "Have you ever killed anyone?" Vaughn didn't answer right away. He tossed a stick into the fire and watched it curl into ash before saying, "Yes." "Was it in war?" No, she didn't press. He didn't offer more. Later, after she'd settled on the bedroll, she turned her face toward him as he stood near the fire, sharpening a small blade with long, even strokes. "When did you last speak to your family?" she asked, voice low but clear. "I don't," he said. "Not anymore." She nodded like she understood. "Mine's buried 2 days behind us." "I know." She rolled to her side and closed her eyes. The next morning they crossed into a narrower valley where the grass grew taller and the wind smelled faintly of sage. Vaughn led the horse by the reins, letting Sienna walk when she asked to. Her stride was stiff at first, but she didn't complain. She studied the tracks in the dirt deer rabbit, once a set of boot prints that made her stop for a long time before moving on. That afternoon, they came upon a small cabin sunk into a hollow near the riverbank, its chimney leaning slightly, door hanging open. Vaughn held up a hand and stepped ahead, rifle raised. She stayed back without needing to be told. He searched it quick and thorough, empty, save for a rotted chair, a rusted stove, and the smell of rat droppings. He waved her in. She stepped inside and looked around, her face unreadable. "You think someone lived here long?" "Not in years," he said. "Roof's near caved." Still, she walked to the far wall and ran her hand along the log seam. "Someone tried to make it a home." "They did." They camped beside it that night, the wind blocked by the cabin's frame. After supper, she surprised him by asking for the knife he'd used earlier. He handed it over without comment, and she sat with a piece of wood, carving slowly. Her hands weren't steady, but her eyes were. "What are you making?" "Something small," she said. "Something mine." He gave a short nod, then turned his gaze to the fire. The next morning, she handed the carving to him without a word. It was crude but careful, a bird with outstretched wings. He turned it over once in his palm, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. That afternoon, they crossed the river barefoot, boots slung over their shoulders, the water biting and fast. She lost her balance once and grabbed the sleeve of his shirt. He steadied her with both hands, and for a moment their eyes met, her fingers still curled in the fabric at his elbow. She let go first. By dusk, they reached a ridgeline that looked down on a patch of cottonwoods. Between them, a ranch house stood modest but well-kept, smoke rising from the chimney. "You know them?" she asked. Vaughn nodded. "Name's Dorsey." "They owe me a favor." "What kind?" "I brought their boy back once, got caught in a flash flood, took a day to find him." She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "You're not what I thought you'd be." "What you think I'd be?" "I didn't think you'd stay." He didn't smile. Just adjusted the cinch on his saddle and said, "Come on, they'll have supper." The Dorseys welcomed them without question. Mrs. Dorsey pressed Sienna into a warm chair and filled a plate without asking what she'd seen. "Mr." Dorsey pulled Vaughn aside and handed him a wrapped bundle, extra cartridges, dried beans, a flask of corn whiskey. They stayed the night in the hayloft. Vaughn spread blankets and gave her the softer side, saying nothing when she curled close to the wall. Before she fell asleep, she said, "I don't know what I am now." "You're still you," he said. "That's enough." She didn't answer, but her breathing slowed. Outside, the wind shifted north. Vaughn lay awake a long time, watching the slats in the roof glow faint with moonlight. By the time they left the Dorsey ranch, the earth had softened under the recent rain, and the scent of wet grass clung to their boots. Sienna walked now with steadier steps, the bruising on her ankle fading beneath the hem of a skirt she'd bartered for before dawn. She hadn't asked Vaughn to wait while she spoke with Mrs. Dorsey in the kitchen, but when she stepped out, he was still by the gate, reins in hand, his face unreadable as the overcast sky. They headed west toward the edge of the Wind River Range, where the hills rose in long green folds and the rock faces caught the late sun like burnished copper. Vaughn said little, but his path through the country was deliberate. Sienna noticed how he avoided the ridgelines, how he studied the tree lines before they stopped for water, how he always stepped between her and any sudden sound. That evening, as they camped beneath a limestone bluff scattered with bird nests, she crouched near the fire and asked without looking up, "Was this your land once?" He glanced at her, then back to the flames. "No. I've never owned a thing that couldn't be carried. You don't want to," he took his time answering. "I used to, tried once, but the land didn't want me back," she nodded, picking a pine needle from her skirt. "Were you married?" "No, close. No," she looked up then, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You're not much for lies, are you?" His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Wouldn't serve either of us." Later that night, she asked to hold the rifle. He handed it to her after checking the chamber, and she sat with it across her knees, careful with the weight. She didn't ask how it worked. She just held it steady, her fingers tightening on the worn stock. In the morning, they crossed paths with a trapper hauling pelts behind a mule. Vaughn spoke to him briefly while Sienna stood apart, watching a hawk wheel high above the ridge. When Vaughn returned, he handed her a roll of cloth. "Flour and lard," he said. "He owed me," she raised an eyebrow. "You collect debts from every man in Wyoming, just the ones who leave a trail." They made camp that night near a shallow stream that ran clear over a bed of small stones. Sienna knelt to wash her hands and face, letting the water run down her arms, her sleeves pushed to the elbow. Vaughn sat on a flat rock nearby, carving a strip of rawhide with a small blade. "You look different," he said. She turned her head, water dripping from her chin. "How so?" "Less like someone who's waiting to wake up." She looked down at her reflection and touched the scar near her temple. "I still see them, every time I close my eyes. I know. I don't want to forget them, you won't." She turned toward him then, eyes narrowed. "What do you carry?" His hands paused on the rawhide. "A brother I didn't save, a land I couldn't hold. A woman once begged me to stay and I never answered." Sienna's gaze didn't waver. "And now, he said, setting the strip down, "I stay." She crossed to him, dropping to a crouch. "Why?" "Because it matters now." They didn't speak again until the fire was down to embers. She lay close enough to feel the warmth of him behind her, not touching, but near enough it steadied her. Before sleep took her, she whispered, "I don't know where I belong." His voice came soft, just above her ear. "You belong with someone who won't leave." When she woke the next morning, he was already breaking camp, but something had shifted. He moved slower, waiting for her to catch up. When she reached for the saddlebag, he let her take it. They walked side by side most of the day. She didn't glance back anymore. They reached the foothills just past sundown, where the earth grew rockier and the air held the hush of high country. The horse moved slower now, its breath fogging faint in the cooler wind. Vaughn led it by the bridle, his steps even and patient. Sienna walked beside him, boots worn but holding. A stand of spruce trees opened into a low meadow, and Vaughn stopped short. "We'll stop here," he said, nodding toward a rise where the trees offered cover and the ground sloped gentle toward a stream. As she gathered dry needles and limbs for the fire, Vaughn knelt by the stream and filled the canteens. He didn't speak until he returned and handed one to her. "We're near Lander. Another day, maybe two." She poured a little water into a tin and dipped a cloth inside, scrubbing at her forearms. "What's in Lander?" "Old friends got a forge there, might know someone needing a hand." She wrung out the cloth and hung it on a branch. "You looking for work? For both of us, if you want it." She watched the fire leap up from the kindling and catch. "I can sew, cook a little. Can't say I'm quick with figures, but I kept my father's books when he was ill." Vaughn settled onto a flat stone and stretched out his legs. "That'll be enough." She sat across from him, arms wrapped around her knees. "You ever think about staying anywhere long?" "Sometimes. You'd want land, I'd want quiet, and space enough for what matters." Sienna was silent a moment, then said, "What matters?" He didn't look away from the flames. "Someone to see sunrise with. Someone to wait for when the trail turns long." He didn't ask her what she wanted. She wasn't sure yet if she could say it. That night, the wind shifted through the trees, and she dreamed of a windowless room filled with smoke and screams. When she woke, her breath came hard, her fingers clenched in the blanket. Vaughn was already sitting up, rifle across his lap, but he didn't ask questions. He just leaned forward and handed her his coat. She didn't put it on. She just draped it across her knees, her hands buried in the lining. "I thought I was underground. You're not. I know." Her voice trembled once, then steadied, but I felt it, the weight of it, like I couldn't breathe. Vaughn reached over, slow and sure, and placed one hand over hers. "You're here." "That's all that's real." In the morning, Sienna didn't mention the dream again. She rose early and boiled water for coffee before Vaughn stirred. When he sat up, she handed him a cup and said, "We'll make Lander before dark if we keep pace." He raised an eyebrow. "Taking charge now, just figuring where the road bends." They broke camp quickly. The higher sun brought warmth, and with it the scent of pine sap and wild onions crushed underfoot. As they climbed a shallow ridge, Sienna paused at the summit and looked back. "Feels different up here," she said. Vaughn stood beside her, gaze sweeping the hills below. "It is." She turned to him, face clear, voice even. "I'm not afraid the way I was." He didn't answer, just tipped his hat back and met her eyes. They made Lander by dusk. Smoke curled from chimneys and dogs barked in the distance. The forge stood on the edge of town, a wide-beamed structure with blackened stone walls and a tin roof that caught the last light. Vaughn walked through the open gate without knocking, and an older man with soot on his sleeves stepped out from behind a wagon axle. "Vaughn Reddick," he said with a slow grin. "I'll be damned." Vaughn shook his hand firm. "Elias, you still bending iron? Only when the weather's kind." Sienna stood at the edge of the yard, waiting. Vaughn gestured for her. "This is Sienna Whitlow." Elias gave her a nod. "You with him?" She opened her mouth, paused, then nodded once. "Yes, I am." Elias rubbed his chin. "We could use a hand cleaning scrap, tending the bellows. My wife's needing help with the ledger too, if you've a mind." Sienna looked to Vaughn, then back to Elias. "I'd like that." Vaughn slept that night in the barn loft, Sienna in the room above the forge where Elias's daughter once kept her sewing. The bed was narrow, the quilt coarse, but the roof didn't leak, and the walls held a quiet that felt like something earned. In the stillness, she touched the scar above her temple, then reached beneath her pillow and drew out the carving she'd kept hidden since the cabin. She ran her thumb along the wings, then set it on the windowsill. Outside, Vaughn leaned against the fence, arms folded, watching the stars. She didn't call out, she just watched him a while longer, then lay back down, and for the first time in weeks, she slept without waking. The forge rang with rhythm. Vaughn worked the bellows while Elias shaped iron, and the whole place smelled of hot metal and oil-soaked wood. Outside, the cottonwoods had just begun to yellow at their edges, and the mornings came with frost that clung to the pump handle and the fence rails. Sienna kept to the ledger in the loft office, copying the day's orders with careful ink strokes. She'd taken to tying her hair back with a scrap of blue cloth Elias's wife had offered her, and her hands, once soft, now bore faint calluses at the knuckles from hauling water and coal. She liked the work. It required precision but not thought, and left space in her mind for other things. She saw Vaughn each day, sometimes only in passing him hauling scrap to the smelter, her wiping soot from a window pane, but there was something in the way they met eyes now. Not surprise, not hesitation, a quiet agreement. One afternoon, she stepped out into the yard with a tin of nails and found Vaughn sitting on the porch rail, his coat off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was watching the hills beyond town, where the sun was slipping behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the pasture. "Elias says you've got an eye for horse lines," she said, handing him the tin. "I know a good shoulder when I see one." She sat beside him, careful not to let their arms touch. "You ever think about raising stock instead of trailing it?" Thought about it once. "Never had the means." "What if you did?" He turned to her. "You thinking of buying me a ranch?" She smiled, but it faded as she looked out at the hills. "There's a parcel just north of here, 3 acres of pasture, a spring-fed creek. Elias's wife showed me the deed, belonged to her cousin. Widow moved back east, left it behind." Vaughn watched her a moment. "You want it?" "I want somewhere that doesn't disappear when the wind shifts." He looked down at his hands, then back toward the forge. You think we could make it work? I know we could. Vaughn stood and walked a few steps into the yard before turning back. We'd need more than 3 acres. Chickens, maybe a milk cow, a garden. You sure you want that kind of stillness? I'm tired of leaving things behind. He nodded once, then offered her his hand. She took it and rose. That evening they walked to the edge of the lot where the creek ran shallow and cold. He knelt and cupped water in his hands, letting it fall again. Then he stood and faced her. I've known how to leave since I was 15, he said, but I don't want to anymore, not from you. She stepped forward until the space between them was gone. Then don't. He touched her face like she was something he wasn't sure he could deserve. You're certain? I've never been more. He kissed her soft, like he'd been waiting to get it right, and she leaned into him, hands flat against his chest, grounding them both. 2 months later, the house was theirs. A single-story frame with a crooked porch and a roof that needed patching. They repaired it by hand, side by side, her hammering shingles, him setting new hinges on the barn door. She painted the front shutters blue. They married under the cottonwoods just before the frost came in earnest. Elias stood witness, and his wife tied a length of ribbon around their joined hands, murmuring a blessing too old for books. Sienna wore a dress borrowed from Elias's daughter-in-law, and Vaughn had shaved for the occasion, though she told him afterward not to bother next time. That winter they planted nothing, just learned the land. Sienna kept a journal of seeds they'd try come spring. Vaughn built a pen for hens and a smokehouse from reclaimed timber. They spoke little of what came before, only when sleep was thin or when the wind rose loud enough to stir old memory. But they never turned from each other. When one touched the past, the other waited steady until it passed. Come March, crocuses pushed up near the porch rail. Sienna bent to touch one and looked back to find Vaughn watching her, hammer still in hand from the fence post he was setting. She stood, brushed dirt from her palms, and walked to him. You ever think, she said, how strange it is that I found you that day? No, he said, wrapping an arm around her waist. I think it was the only thing that ever made sense, and it was. They built a life where silence wasn't absence, where every morning began with a glance, not a word, and every night ended with a hand folded into another. The land stayed quiet. The house held its warmth, and they never left again.